of us, sometimes out of need, wish for a treasure, to search for it and to find it. Some by chance with a little luck, do find it. Some do research, search in earnest, even scientifically, and then, others without looking find it. Yes, that is how it happens. Some just find it, and others do not. However, to search for it is the main point. It is good therapy. Even if that is not the objective. In every state and city of the country of Mexico there are treasures, buried, walled in, gold and silver coins which were commonly used, more in some places and less in others. There were so many wars, so many armed movements, among them the most outstanding the War of Independence and the Revolution. And faced with the ever-present threat of burnings, thefts and looting, people would bury or hide their money, and many times it was not recovered, remaining hidden for years, up to the present time. In recent years, another form of hiding treasures has become common. Drug dealers have lots of money in dollars which cannot be deposited in banks, and it is rumored that now they bury them wrapped in several bags of plastic to preserve them, because it is paper money and I suppose very difficult to detect. For as far as I know no device has been invented yet that can do that. The hearsay is that several years ago the practice was started in the state of Sinaloa, but I suppose it has extended to the rest of the country. Many of those persons die and many of those hoards remain hidden, buried. The following stories actually happened, but of course the real names of the individuals have been changed. As in every story of treasures there is always a bit of fiction. In this really very little, something words. Mole, traditional sauce, with several seasonings and ingredients, among them chocolate. Buñuelos, a kind of flour fritter the size of a plate and so thin as to be almost transparent. Piloncillo, dark molasses shaped like a small cone boiled in water to make a heavy dark syrup. Atole blanco, a drink made of cornmeal in water to tone down the sweetness of syrupy dishes. Nopals, cactus leaves. Molcajete, mortar and pestle made from volcanic rock used to grind foods and seasonings. Comal, round flat griddle usually made of cooked clay. Charales, small dry fish. Café de olla, coffee prepared in a clay pot sweetened with molasses and flavored with cinnamon. Agua de Jamaica, hibiscus leaves tea. Tamales de espiga, tamales made of corn and wheat flour. Maguey, agave plant. Magueyras, a spot where many agaves grow together. Semita con nata, bread made of bran and wheat flours and covered with buttery skin from boiled milk. Corundas, tamales made with dried corn and lard. Nata, buttery skin from boiled milk. Don Juan. I met Don Juan in a coffee shop ice cream shop. It was the first time I had been in a place like that. He occupied the small house where the recently opened business was located. Right across from the main plaza or central garden. The whole family took care of the place, Don Juan, his wife and children. They dispensed different flavors of ice cream, the ever-present lemon sherbet with red wine, as well as coffee, tea, cakes and cookies. I had a pleasant time and enjoyed my coffee but was left with a burning curiosity. How had Don Juan managed to open that business when just a few days earlier they were selling turkey and mole to survive and keep ahead? They did that every Sunday. They would bring out a modest wooden table covered with a very clean tablecloth on which they had mole, tacos, small dishes of jelly and cider for sale. They would place it on the street, right in front of the building that now houses the new ice cream shop. I was very curious. I walked through the town's old cobblestone streets and got home. Sitting at the table about to have my evening tea, I asked my parents who were acquainted with Don Juan, how had he managed to rent the place where he had opened the ice cream shop, since only wealthy people could afford to open a business in the center of town, and they told me that Don Juan was extremely wealthy. Not only had he bought the place where the shop was located, but in the same street, only a couple of blocks away, he had bought a big house where they now lived. Besides, they now owned several cars, many parcels of land, houses and lots of money. And they told me the story. Don Juan and his family had lived for many years in the outskirts of the city in an old house where they raised turkeys and pigs and subsisted with the sale of the pigs, turkey meat and mole. In one of the many humdrum days when Don Juan was feeding the animals, as he watched the pigs, he saw one of them uncover some small wooden boards under the mud with its snout. Since the black rubber boots he was wearing were full of holes, he was not sure he wanted to pick up those boards from the mud, but then he realized they may be of use to him. If he dried them he could use them as firewood to cook the turkeys and the mole. So he got into the muddy field, but when he tried to pick up the boards, he could not. It was practically impossible. Upon cleaning up the place he found out that the boards were nailed together forming the top of a crate, so very calmly he went out in search of a hammer to pull out the nails. He was back shortly and slowly, without giving it much thought or speculating about what may be in the box. He proceeded to remove the boards, but upon taking off the first one he was so amazed he almost fainted. The box was full of gold coins. Crying and thanking God most sincerely, he proceeded to take the top off, and the rest is history. In the early days of December Don Juan came to our house and invited us to celebrate Christmas with his family. When the day arrived the two families went to church to give thanks. We were all curious about what we were going to have for dinner. Already on the table was the ever-present turkey in mole, free-range turkey of course, tortillas made by hand, the traditional rice with peas, refried beans with cheese, cider and buñuelos with piloncillo syrup accompanied by atole blanco. So all we had to do was bless our food. Don Berna lived with his family in the mining town of Angangio, Michoacan. He was a farmer and shopkeeper. He could read, write and do arithmetic. In those days he was considered a well-educated man. That was in 1916. He had lived there a long time when he decided to change his place of residence. It was time to try new airs, so he bought a farm near the city of Tuxpan, with a house that had everything he wanted. A big oven to bake bread and a good stove to cook and bake tortillas, enough rooms for all his children and a pleasant room for his wife and himself plus 6 hectares to plant cows, horses and chickens. Although it was a very old house, it looked like new. The former owner had lived in it only a few months. The house was surrounded by beautiful gardens and an area of lovely trees with benches and swings. The only fault was that on the main entrance there were 2 stone steps, and one of the stones would move slightly whenever someone went in or out. But that was not a big problem. They got used to it very rapidly. They enjoyed a good life, him and his family, and in a short time, Don Berna, as he was called by everyone, was appointed judge in the very city of Tuxpan, and he remained for some years in that position. This city was close to the farm and he could get back and forth on his horse in a short time across the short distance. After some time, because of his competence in that job, he was offered the position of administrator in a hacienda, and although it was some distance from his house it was worth it. The pay was good and had additional benefits. He had the job for several years and as his savings increased he decided to quit, sell his farm and move to a larger city, where he bought a third of a block in a well-to-do neighborhood as well as a ranch of more than 80 hectares in the outskirts. The old house and the farm in Tuxpan he sold to a very humble man who could not pay him in full, so there was an amount of money left outstanding. Soon the new dwellers got used to the shaking stone in the steps, but after a few weeks one of the sons decided to fix it. He bought all the necessary supplies and made some mortar so that set the stone in place. He removed it, set it aside, cleaned the cavity and looked for the best way to pour the mortar in, when he was left speechless. In the hole protruded the mouth of a clay pot. He cleaned the dirt on it and through the dust he could see the shine of many gold coins. In his mind there was only one thought, to settle his father's debt. Don Berna led a full life. His wife that day had prepared a stew of nopals with pork in a sauce made by hand in the molkajit with tomatoes and hot green peppers, plus free-range eggs scrambled with fresh churals grilled on a whitewashed clay kamal, tortillas made by hand and cooked on the same kamal, beans, aqua de Jamaica, nice and cold, followed by fruit, and to finish properly, a cup of café de olla. The gold coins had not been meant for Don Berna and his family. Memo was a good playmate and a great friend. He dreamed of becoming a professional boxer and behaved like he was older. Although I was 12 years old and he not more than 16, he was always giving us advice on any subject. He was very knowledgeable and restless. His dad was a baker and there were a lot of brothers and sisters, but only one of them worked driving a cargo truck and the rest of the brothers were students. All the girls helped with their household expenses. Very early in the morning the four sisters would go to market to sell piggies, thin, cookie-style breads, made with pilonslow and shaped like a pig. They would travel to the market daily and always managed to sell all of their bread. They all lived in a very narrow house, only 4.5 meters in front by some 40 meters in depth. We were neighbors. We lived only about 30 meters apart on the same sidewalk. According to some ancient property deed, in the olden days, the area where we lived had belonged to a Russian countess, and in Memo's house, one of the old baking ovens from the former hacienda, was still being used to bake the bread. The whole neighborhood, every home, had some remains of the old buildings. There were old and thick pieces of masonry everywhere. Time passed by filled with our games. Until one day Memo's dad got the notion to enlarge the oven faced with the great demand for bread piggies. He needed to make it bigger so that he could bake more bread and increase their income. Memo could not come out to play since he was helping his dad. About 2 hours had gone by when suddenly Memo came out screaming, "We are rich! We are rich! We have found money!" His dad with a scolding got him back in the house immediately. They had found money in the old oven. As time went by they lived in a much bigger house, perhaps 10 times larger than the house where they lived previously. They had land, trucks and businesses. And they did not sell bread piggies anymore. Memo, who had money now, during the whole week would invite us at around 7 o'clock in the evening, all of his friends, to eat corundas at the market stall, those flat corundas called corundas served with heavy cream and a very spicy salsa made with tomatoes and green chilies, and always, we had a second helping. Cuco. Cuco was the permanent friend of the rich kids in town, but he was poor, and although he dressed well and wore nice shoes, the time came when his friends grew up and their expenses and needs increased. The time of courtship arrived, the serenading of the sweetheart, the parties, invitations for coffee, card games, riding around in a nice car, the time to go away to college. The years went by and Cuco was already 21 years old and had no money, and what was even worse, he did not go to school, so naturally he felt excluded. A good friend helped him see reality and helped him realize that he was not rich, he had no schooling, no work, and advised him to go to Mexico City to find work. He could get a nice job there. and so he did and filled applications at many places. One of the few things he knew how to do was to drive, so with that and the little schooling he had, the only job he found was working as a salesman for metal detection instruments, you know, the kind to find treasures with. That was not what Cuco was hoping for, but it was a job. On top of that, it was not in Mexico City, but in order to sell them he had to travel all over the country, and so he began in Zacatecas, which is where he was sent to go door to door. It was very difficult, but that is exactly what he had to do. It was the only way to sell the treasure detectors. At least he had enough to eat and a little to spare. Many times he returned to the city for more detectors, which he called dream machines, and so he was able to visit all the cities in the state of Zacatecas. And so it went for many years, traveling through all the states of the Republic. Those were different times, back around 1970. He had gone through many states and countless cities before a surprise came his way. He was going to the state of Guanajuato, and one of its cities was only 3 hours from his hometown, the place where he had been born and had spent his childhood, adolescence and part of his young adult years so happily. Finally he covered the whole state of Guanajuato, leaving to the end that city that was so close to his hometown, Acámbaro. The time finally arrived when he made his way towards it. He arrived at night. He had already restocked his merchandise. His truck was loaded with new machines. He checked in at a hotel, the first one he saw, as he was tired. Next day he calculated he would be staying at least 2 months in that place, since he was planning on visiting all the neighboring towns, so he decided to rent a house on the edge of town. It wasn't easy, but finally he found a large house, that although old, had a garage, and even though the rent was high, it still would be much cheaper than a hotel room. The house had no furniture at all, so he bought everything he needed, as he considered that at the end of the stay he would take home all the things he bought. He also hired someone to do the cleaning and finally got settled in as he wished. He was very happy in his new abode, and dedicated himself to work, offering his detectors, which obviously he couldn't always sell. Among all that people he tried to convince of the qualities and virtues of the detectors, he came across an elderly gentleman who said to him, "So my friend, if your machines are as good as you say, how come you have not located a treasure yourself?" And so he got to thinking that it was true. He had found absolutely nothing, never located any treasure. He only sold the detectors. So he went home to rest in a very thoughtful mood. He laid down for a while, but an idea came into his mind, and he made a decision. He would test one of the machines right there in that old house. And so he went and got a detector from the truck, turned it on and began to test it right inside the house, first in the bedrooms, one by one. He felt awkward. Curiously, it was not the same to demonstrate it to a customer, doing simple tests with pieces of iron and a silver spoon he always carried with him, to working to do field work in earnest and in a search to benefit himself. But as time went by, he felt better, even happy. He tried in all the bedrooms, on the floors and walls, and found nothing. Then he tried the old garden, also nothing. Then suddenly, there, machine started to beep. He had found something. Quickly he went to his truck to get a spade and started to dig where the detector signaled. After a good while he found metal. It was only an old mattock. He rested for a while, and with rare happiness he kept on searching in the garage, in some of the patios, the living room, dining room and the bathrooms. He tried everywhere, on the floors, the walls. Nothing. He only had to search the old kitchen and the laundry area. But it was already 3 o'clock in the morning and he had to go to work. He fell asleep tired but content, and slept until late in the morning, got up and went quickly to work, as he was leaving for a town somewhat distant from Acámbaro. So he went there. It was his job. He had to go to all the towns in the neighborhood. He returned late into the night and went straight to sleep. Next day he would remain in Acámbaro and work there. He felt a little tired. And he worked in the city all day long. Evening came with a thought that would not leave him alone. He was feeling all the weariness of the routine, and he was worried because his savings were so small. And so, to make his burden lighter, he decided to keep on trying with the metal detector. He knew he had left only the laundry area and the kitchen, but that was enough for him, so he went straight to work on his search. Turned on the machine and searched the laundry area over and below the stone basin, in the small surrounding patio, and nothing. He continued with the kitchen, on the floor, the walls, and nothing either. There remained only some small structures attached to the old kitchen. He searched everywhere but found no signal of anything. Now the only thing left to search was an isolated structure which apparently had been used as a cellar to store food. He started his search again, and much to his surprise heard a faint noise in the lower part of one of the walls of the old cellar. As he moved the detector from side to side, there was a faint signal. He remained quiet for a few minutes, and raised the metal detector, and a strong signal was heard from the highest part of the wall. Quickly he went to grab something to hit with, the spade. From his bedroom he grabbed one of the chairs he had bought so he could be at a higher level. And although a bit uncomfortably, he proceeded to hit hard, without accomplishing anything. So he considered what to do, and he remembered that he had an old hammer in the truck, so he went to get it and did the same as before, standing on the chair and hitting hard. Pieces of wall started to fall, and then gold and silver coins, as well as pieces of clay from the multiple pots that were hidden in the wall. With a rapidly beating heart he continued hitting. And then, more relaxed, he finished his job around 4 in the morning. In cardboard boxes, plastic bags, of those that are used at the store for groceries, and in the suitcases where his clothes were packed, he stored all the coins he could, and many others he just simply wrapped in newspapers. He awoke at 9 in the morning, and surprisingly without any sleepiness he went to town to buy several traveling suitcases, sand, cement, lime, gypsum and paint. He returned to the house and carefully covered all the holes he had made in the wall, packed all the coins in the suitcases. At 3 in the afternoon he left to go to his native land. After all those years he was extremely happy to see his family again. He only stayed that one night. He didn't tell them anything. He had to go to Mexico City to quit his job. Once there he went to his humble and small house, then straight to quit his job and turn in the truck. On the third day he bought himself a large house, a car and many, many other things. He also bought an office building where he occupied a whole floor as director of a company selling the best treasure detectors in the world. 1 month after he began his new life, he was rich. He was his own boss, and best of all, he was very happy. A few days later he arrived in his hometown to bring his whole family with him. All of them, to live in Mexico City. And they all were rich. Once in a great while Cuco returned to his hometown. His innumerable friends then knew all about his life. Because of the magazines that advertised the treasure detectors, the dreamed machines, Wick had made him a very rich man. A bit more often he would return to Acambaro, and right away he would go to eat in a restaurant in the center of town, right in front of the garden. Outdoors. First they would serve him vegetable soup with handmade tortillas, then a beefsteak with refried beans, delicious, just like butter, a delicious dessert made of pumpkin covered in nata with a glass of milk. And finally, hot coffee. The Garage and El Pelos. The Hairy One. It was a mechanic's shop where El Pelos worked the night shift. He would go in at 9 p.m. and leave at 5, 6 or 7 am, according to how much work there was. He would wash motors, do the cleaning and do some small repair jobs. His boss, Sergio, would do nothing. He was the boss. All he did was supervise the workers, and of course, make sure all the jobs were done right. He arrived late, around 12 noon, always smiling and polite, respectful and friendly. He was about 50 years old. El Pelos was about 40, and already going bald. The few hairs he had, he would grow long so he could comb them over and make a large ponytail. He was very tall and toothless, very likable and somewhat sarcastic. The main thing at the shop was they always had plenty of work. The other one, every day, come evening, from about 9 p.m., a part of the shop would turn into a gathering place where drinking, dining and conversation on May topics took place. Any friend could join in. We usually left around 2 or 3 in the morning. El Pelos would stay working by himself, with the company of a glass with his Cuba and a radio that barely worked, and of course, his always present cigarettes. When Paco was nicknamed the treasure seeker, he had studied with the Japanese, at college level, the detection of metals of every type, including gold and silver, and he made a living by offering his services as a treasure hunter. He was very successful, and several times he did find treasure, not for himself, but for other people. Knowing this, a man who was very anxious to search for a presumed treasure hired him, since he was absolutely sure there was hidden money in his commercial property. The shop was about to be vacated and had already been rented again. Finally the day arrived. The shop was now empty. It was about 5 by 7 meters and was part of an old building built late in the 19th century, so Paco got busy with the job of searching all over the floor and the 4 walls with his equipment, but the machine kept signaling only in the direction of Sergio's mechanical shop, located exactly next door to this shop. Paco and his client decided to dig in the floor exactly next to the wall in the direction of Sergio's shop. They made a large hole but did not find anything. The metal detector was probably signaling towards the mechanical shop because of the large amount of scrap metal piled on the floor there. Paco and his client did not find anything. They opened the doors of the business to remove the rubble left from the digging, and Sergio came over to talk to Paco. Without any secrecy, Paco told him they were looking for a treasure but that in fact all the readings were towards the mechanical shop. He said there were some very weak readings indicating the presence of gold, but the probabilities that there was actually any gold were very few. Sergio was left with the uncertainty, with many questions, so he decided to rent a metal detector and search. He wanted to find out what was in his shop. In a few days he got the detector, and one Sunday he tested it all over the old place. But I was the same, all he found was scrap metal and a weak signal for gold. That was enough for him and he got really excited. He would look for his treasure later. He told all his friends his experience, and of course there were the most diverse opinions. El Pelos only smiled. The shop was also a remnant from the early 19th century, part of an old manor house built with adobe and quarry stone, and had a floor made of dovetailing strips of wood black with age and wear. The only new part of the building had a concrete floor. That was where the cars were parked. Finally Sergio made up his mind to dig, and he decided to tear down a wall rather than have to move a great quantity of junk and scrap metal to get nearer the spot where he thought the gold was. Meanwhile El Pelos just smiled, and thought that under those conditions it was very difficult to dig. It was a junk pile of scrap metal. Meantime, one night when El Pelos was alone, he decided to move all the scrap metal from the area where the gold was supposedly located, and so he did. To remove and then replace the scrap took him almost 2 hours. To that he would have to add the time to remove the strips of wood, but he already had a plan, so very tired he went home to sleep. Days went by and finally El Pelos decided to speak to Sergio. He asked for permission to miss work on Monday, because he was taking his mother to see a doctor in Mexico City, but he said that in order to make up for the time, he would stay at work Saturday night and a great part of Sunday. Sergio accepted without objection his request. Saturday night El Pelos didn't drink any of his usual Cubas, he drank only sodas and coffee. Everything went on as usual, and around 3 in the morning he was all alone again. Immediately he left what he was doing and started to remove the scrap metal. This took him a little more than 1 hour. Now it was time to remove part of the floor made of strips of wood. The hardest part was taking off the first one with only a common screwdriver. He paused to get a drink of coffee, as he was very hyper. In an effort to calm down he lighted a cigarette. While he smoked, he thought that most likely he would not find anything. He didn't even have tools to remove the wooden ribbons, and worst of all, if he didn't place them back correctly, there would be suspicions and he may get fired. El Pelos lived in town with his mother in a very humble home, a wooden house with cardboard roofing, and besides, it was loaned to them and in great contrast to the modern neighboring houses. They had no stove or refrigerator. They really were extremely poor. El Pelos continued removing the floorboards, smiling with a mix of sadness and resignation. He had done another hour of work with very little progress. He had removed only a few wooden strips when suddenly, hidden between the supports of the floor joists, he saw a wooden box. He only had to remove another 2 ribbons in order to be able to remove the heavy box. He placed it on top of one of the work tables and proceeded to put the strips back in their place. Fortunately they fitted correctly, but just to be safe, he applied a little bit of burned oil on top of them with a broom, and then he replaced all the scrap metal. The place looked practically the same as before. He stopped to rest for a moment, took a sip of his coffee, placed the box in a sack and left the shop carrying his heavy burden and went home. Sergio kept on looking, digging, searching. Now it was his son who worked at night. El Pelos did not work there anymore. Some 5 months had gone by when walking through a downtown streets in town I saw El Pelos leaning on the door of a house belonging to a friend, who was among the wealthy in town. I stopped and greeted him. "How are you?" And I asked him, "Hey, what are you doing here? You do not go to the car shop anymore?" He answered me, "This is my house now, I live here with my mum and I don't go to the shop because I don't do any work now." So I added, "Where have you been?" And he answered smiling, "In Acapulco and other places, touring with my mum." El Pelos dressed in fancy clothes, wearing good shoes, with his teeth fixed and his hair combed, still with his ponytail, but he was a different man. Sergio remained the same, he was the boss in his shop. El Pelos and I met that evening next door to the car shop. It was a cenaduria, and we ate crispy fried tacos filled with shredded beef, with sour cream and covered with grated cheese and green salsa, tasty tamales and a sweet and delicious atole de pinole. Paco and Luis. Searches conducted by Luis were frequently extensive and good. He found out not only that all the people of Anganguillo, a mining town for hundreds of years, knew of the existence of an old abandoned house where it was claimed a large amount of silver and jewelry had been buried, but that the oldest residents confirmed it. Paco and Luis prepared all their detection equipment, and were in Anganguillo. They quickly got to the old house dating from the 19th century, but there was a problem. It was very difficult to access the house since it was boarded up, doors and windows covered with bricks, and besides it was on the main street, in plain sight of everyone. But Paco was not giving up. He was counting on that, so they went to the street behind the house in question and knocked on the home right next to it. A man already quite advanced in years came to the door. Paco told him what they wanted to do and without stopping for breath promised him they would give him 20% of whatever they found in silver and jewelry. Smiling, the elderly gentleman accepted the offer but told them that first they would have to jump over a high wall and then break another wall since the house was also bricked up on the back part. Paco, quick thinking and quick acting, went downtown to the stores to purchase a sledgehammer and some votive lights, leaving Luis behind talking to the old man. In a short while he returned with the supplies and told the gentleman he had arranged for a mason to come over later to repair the wall they would knock down. They jumped the wall and saw what apparently had been an opening for a door now walled up and knocked down the construction within the original opening. Once the brickwork was removed, things started to look clearer through the hole. So they brought the metal detectors and the votive candles, and looked around. The house was full of old furniture and Tiffany lamps. It was no small thing, although they were not aware of how valuable those were. They began to work testing the detectors on the floor, but to do that, they had to move all the furniture, bedroom by bedroom, living room, dining room, kitchen, bathrooms. But they got no signal. They did the same with all the walls, but still no response. There was left only a wall obstructed by a heavy wardrobe. Finally they were able to move it and they ran the metal detectors all over the wall. But still, nothing. They moved the wardrobe back in place and Paco insisted on opening it. With a lot of work they finally did. There were lots of things inside, clothing, women's hats and a pretty box that caught their attention. It was locked and rather light, so they got it out to take with them. They took what they considered little things. The lamps and the box. They were finished, so they jumped the wall. They had 2 sacks, one with the lamps and another one with the box. While the stonemason fixed the wall, Paco went out to purchase food. They were tired and very hungry. The old man looked at the items. They had found no silver or jewels. Only some old lamps and a box. Paco returned and they all ate, and during the after-dinner conversation they offered the old man his share of the objects. But he refused. In his opinion they were better off selling all the stuff, and maybe, if they were lucky, they may earn enough money to cover their expenses. It was over. Paco and Luis very gratefully said their goodbyes, and left. It was very late. They went to the church in the center of Angangueo and prayed. When they came out it was already night. Nearby they bought some tortas stuffed with fig compote and a delicious atole also made with figs. And they went back to their town. Next day when they opened the box they found it full of old postage stamps. They took them to Mexico City to sell. Luckily in a downtown cafe they had some good friends and one of them helped them. They got very good money for the stamps. And also for the lamps. It turned out just as good as if they had found silver and jewels. They made a small fortune. Paco y Luis and Jungle Apio. It was in the year 1988 when this story was narrated to me by the very protagonists. Paco was a professional. His job had always been that of treasure hunter. He studied to become one and he constantly practiced with his metal detectors. He would bury gold, silver and assorted metals at different depths and would then make exact locations with his equipment. He never failed. Luis was a great friend of Paco. He was also a treasure hunter, but although he also used detecting equipment, Luis concentrated mostly in the history and legends of areas where buried, hidden or walled-in treasure was supposed to be located. One time he was told about the enormous amount of money in gold and silver that had been buried during the War of Independence in a region near the town of Jungle Apio in Michoacan, and he invited Paco to share the adventure of searching in that place. To be always working with the expectation of finding something amazing was exciting and hopeful. The area they were going to search was very large, so they decided to leave early in the morning, and nervous and excited they left before daybreak. After 2 hours on the bus and walking for a few minutes on a dirt road, they arrived in a hamlet with just a few houses. From there they moved to the land where they were going to search. This was a place already known to Luis. Away in the distance the old arches from the ancient aqueduct could be seen. In order to gather strength before beginning they sat down on some masonry remains of what appeared to be an old building. probably an old hacienda, and from their baggage took out tortas stuffed with refried beans, panla cheese, ham and pickled hot peppers and 2 soft drinks, and concentrated on eating their lunch while scanning the old construction site where they could see signs of digging and demolished walls all over the place. They did not pay much attention to the ruins of what appeared to have been a grand residence, a large hacienda, for those ruins had already been highly worked. Their main concern was to search in a flat piece of land approximately 1 hectare in size. So when lunch was over they headed toward that place distant only a few meters. When they arrived, Paco prepared his equipment and they proceeded to work with great precision, moving back and forth, north to south, making a very thorough and careful search. But time went by and they were tired, hungry and thirsty. They had found nothing and it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so they decided to eat the remaining 2 tortas. They moved over to a small hill where there was a lonely, very luxuriant tree and some rocks that would make good seats. There was only a small area left to search, but they needed a rest. So they finished eating and drinking, and in about 10 minutes Paco got up and without interrupting their conversation started to test his metal detector right there on the small hill, with the same results. He found nothing either. It was useless. The only remaining place was exactly under the tree where they had sat when unexpectedly, near Luis's feet, they heard the characteristic sound of the detector, signaling it had found something. They were excited and started to dig with a small shovel, until a metallic sound told them they could dig no longer with the shovel. So with their bare hands they started to remove the soil and found a square metal plate, about 40 by 40 centimeters in size and about 2 centimeters in thickness. They had no idea what it was. Immediately Luis went to the hamlet to get a sack where they placed the dirty, dusty and stained plate. Their work was finished, so they went to the highway to catch their bus. It was a bit late when they got back to town. Night was falling, but they were excited and planning to clean the plate the best possible way, and so they did, washing it carefully with soap and a sponge, then with some shampoo and at last with plain water and baking soda. It was sparklingly clean. It looked like German silver, or maybe even sterling, but they decided to take it the next day to be tested to a prestigious silver store to be sure of what it was, what metal it may be. Early in the morning they went to the silver store carrying their precious plate. And right in front of the silversmith they took it out of the sack wrapped in a large towel and placed it on the old counter. The silversmith proceeded to pour some liquid on it with an eyedropper and then, looking straight at them, he said, "It is platinum." Time. In 1981, he was a man about 55 years old and Paco and Luis were about 33 years of age. Immediately and almost simultaneously they asked him, "How much is it worth?" The silversmith, with somewhat sober expression, answered them, "A minimum of $1.5 million pesos. About $122,000. They were utterly amazed. It was a lot of money. They went back to David's house and secured the plate in a safe place. Immediately after they went for a walk around the city, aimlessly, just to decide what they were going to do, how to proceed. And after walking and talking for a while they came to an agreement. They would go to Mexico City to sell the plate to a man named Rafael, a good friend of both of them, who dwelled in the center of the city and had a wide experience in the buying and selling of all kind of items such as gold, silver, old weapons, jewelry, watches, etc. Once they reached a decision, they left for Mexico City, arriving at a cafe near the Zocalo where their friend Rafael could always be found. At that, and yes, Rafael was sitting down having a cup of coffee with 2 other persons. He greeted Paco and Luis very friendly and they sat down, excusing themselves for showing up unexpectedly and exposing their desire to speak alone with Don Rafael. And so the other 2 companions finished their coffee and left them so they could discuss their business. Both Paco and Luis related the story of the plate to Don Rafael, mentioning that they wanted to sell it. Don Rafael proposed that they all took it to get appraised very near, so near that they requested another cup of coffee as they would be back in a short while. The appraisal was done quickly and was very similar to the amount that had been estimated already. 1,655,000 pesos. They went back and sitting at the table all of them, looking at them in earnest, Don Rafa proposed to them to sell the plate. He would buy it. He would give them first an advance of 75,000 pesos, approximately $5,000, and would buy it from them for a total amount of 1,255,000 pesos. He would give them the rest of the money, which was a lot, once he had withdrawn it from the bank where he was going to ask for a loan of some 255,000 pesos, and with that he would pay the full amount. Since his deposit in the bank amounted to 1 million pesos, he would pay that loan quickly since every week he earned money and he spent very little. And while he paid back he would wait, and later with patience he could sell the plate, meanwhile kept safe at the bank. Paco and Luis trusted Don Rafa completely and were glad to accept. So Don Rafa got up from the table. He was going to his apartment for the money. It would take him only a few minutes. In a short while he returned with a bag and 75,000 pesos. He gave them to Paco, while Luis just watched. At the insistence of Don Rafa they counted the money. It was complete. They gave the plate to Don Rafa. There was trust. He agreed in giving them, in less than an hour, 1 million pesos and later the rest. Don Rafa had to go to the bank and he quietly left with the plate under his arm. Paco and Luis discussed how they were going to spend the money. And they agreed, in their family, a house, a truck, clothing and many other things more. The hour was up and in the coffee shop they got a call from Don Rafa. It was going to take him longer because the bank manager had advised to request the credit right away, that way he could bring them the whole of the money. They decided to do some window shopping and then returned again to the coffee shop. It was already 2 o'clock. At 3 when they had decided to have something to eat. There was a call. It was Don Rafa. He had to sign the credit papers at an office on Reforma Avenue and he would be back around 4:30. Paco and Luis, very happy, were waiting and exactly at 4:30 on thought they got another call from Don Rafa. He would return to the coffee shop at 5 o'clock. Paco and Luis were calmly waiting. But it was already past 5 and Don Rafa did not arrive. Luis was blaming the traffic. There must be some bottleneck somewhere that calmed them down. Quickly it was 6 o'clock and he did not arrive. They called his apartment on the phone and there was no answer. So they decided to go there to look for him. He lived only about 10 minutes walking distance from the coffee shop. They arrived at 15 minutes past 6 and they went up only one floor of the old stately mansion, and knocked at the door of one of the apartments. That is where Don Rafa lived. They knocked several times but no one answered the door. They went back down and waited just a few minutes at the front door. There were people coming in and out constantly and Paco asked a rather mature man if he knew Don Rafa and if he had seen him recently. At that question the man answered, "Yes, I have seen him." At that Paco and Luis calmed down. "I saw him around noon. And in about a half hour a moving van arrived and all his things were taken out and they left around 4 o'clock. I think he moved for good, by the way. He never parted with a picture, at least I think it was a picture, that he had very well wrapped in a sack and tied down with cord. You know he sells all kind of things." And walking away he said, "I would recommend you don't go looking in his apartment. It is now empty. I will try to get you his new address. He frequents a coffee shop nearby." With a dying hope, Paco and Luis returned to the coffee shop at 9 o'clock. They gave up and left. Don Rafa never returned. They never again heard from him. Roberto. A lad of 12 and lived with his parents in a rural area. The school year was over. It was vacation time and time to work for Roberto. He would spend this period working for Don Enrique. in an hacienda just 2 hours' travel from the small settlement where they lived. His dad took him and recommended him to the hacendado. Roberto would be picking peaches, apples and pears. He did not know that Don Enrique had 4 children, 1 girl and 3 boys, 2 of them about his own age, and that was a joy for him as he would have someone to play with. Daily, after harvesting the fruit, he would spend all afternoon playing with Don Enrique's sons and hiding away to sneak a smoke with them. He was having a good vacation. But one day when he was on top of a tree cutting fruit, accidentally he let go off the bucket. It fell right on the nose of one of the boys and it started to bleed. Roberto got very scared and ran away aimlessly until he found himself on top of a hill. He had to look for a place to sleep as it was already dark. So walking by the light of the moon he found a small cave. He thought he should clean it up a bit to make a small bonfire to sleep warmly. But as he took a few steps to the interior of the cave he fell down noisily about 20 meters and fainted. The first rays of the sun waked him up. He got up hurt and in pain. On his right you could see the entry to a cave on top of a steep slope, and on his left there was a small access just as high, and in front of him there was just a wall of solid rock. As he dusted himself up he was considering how he was going to get out, when turning to the back saw the entrance to a small cave. It looked handmade, a small arch well formed, well built. So he decided to walk in cautiously in the deep shadows. He lit a match and found himself inside a sort of dome. He set fire to some sticks and what he saw was extraordinary: skeletons of men and animals, swords, weapons, helmets, spurs and many other things, as well as a vast number of skins full of gold coins. He filled the pockets of his pants and his coat with as many coins as he could. And with a great deal of trouble he was finally able to walk up the slope and go home. Roberto explained to his dad and mum what had happened. There was no scolding, and with the gold they lived for many years very comfortably. Until the death of his parents. Roberto was an elderly man when he told me this story. Of course I never believed him. I thought it was only a good story. Time went by and one day it occurred to me to tell the story to Paco, a friend of mine with a good knowledge of treasure hunting and some equipment. He was not surprised and told me that it was true and that he would take me to see someone who also had gone into that cave. We arrived at that man's house and he greeted us very courteously. The man had a good friendship with Paco. He was about 95 years old, in very good shape and very friendly. He invited us in and showed us a sword and a Spanish helmet and told us that many years ago, when he was still very young, he had gone into that cave. He described practically everything exactly like Roberto, and told us that he had gone in twice but because of fear he did not go again, because at the time it was very dangerous to carry cash and even worse to carry gold. Even with all those testimonies I was not satisfied, and in a few days I went to Roberto's house. To my surprise he showed me an old weapon, an antique, some silver spurs and the only old coin he still kept as good luck charm. I asked him in what place exactly was the cave located and he gave me approximate directions to the site and explained where the cave was. Everything had changed a lot. Trees and shrubs, stones, leaves, dirt and branches had transformed the place. He said I would realize that too many years had gone by. So I got myself to that hill, the volcano, and after walking for about 2 hours, at last I went into the cave and found out that I was at an even level. There was no such a thing as a slope. There was no way down. Everything was filled with earth and stones. You only walked about 30 meters from the entry from the mouth of the cave to the small entry across, where the solid wall was. Everything had been buried. I left that place thinking of a way in. I was set on proving if there really was gold, so I went again to see Paco, and the next day we went there to make tests for gold detection. Somewhat difficult to do inside the cave, almost impossible, but according to Paco we would do it from the outside, some 20 or 25 meters below. The cave was formed by 2 enormous rocks, each one in one piece. The outside one measured about 40 meters high, leaning on, supported by, a much larger one, about 70 meters in height, which was part of the hill, so at about the height we estimated the gold to be. We started working and immediately the equipment signaled the existence of the precious metal. Paco had confirmed that there was gold. The real problem now was how to go about digging to get to the inside of the cave. Technically and humanly it was difficult but possible. But perhaps the biggest problem was financial. It would require a big investment. Several weeks went by, but Antonio was determined to finance the adventure. He was an enthusiastic treasure hunter. On the day before departure to the old volcano, he purchased tents, gas and battery lamps, mining boots, utility knives, kitchen knives, a whole set of plastic dishes, sleeping bags, serum against viper and scorpion bite, communication radios, water, food and many other things. And so we spent our first night at the volcano. Far from the entry to the cave, we camped approximately 150 meters distant. The next day we moved to the external part of the cave where the gold was and made several holes where we placed dynamite. No luck, we were not even tickling the big rock. So another day went by and we opted for digging. The cave entry only measured from rock to rock 1 meter 50, it was 30 meters in length and with a depth of about 20 meters or more. We got spades and buckets to carry the stones and earth and started to excavate, but it was very slow going. So Antonio hired 4 miners to help us take out the soil, sticks and stones from the dig. They were a big help and we made some real progress, with the surprise that at the entry to the cave, just below, we found some iron pieces placed from wall to wall parallel to some stone steps which descended in the direction of the inner cave. The miners left, with good progress made, and there was 6 of us, continued working. On the side of the wall we placed an iron bar from side to side, from one rock to the other, and in its center we tied a tackle, a pulley, with the help of a rope and a large bucket, and in that way we advanced much faster. One person would fill the bucket, another one would tie it, and another would bring it up and empty the material. We had an assortment of buckets, so that made the work easier, but nonetheless our exhaustion was great. Several days had gone by and we had discovered exactly nothing. So 3 of the guys left and only 3 of us remained. I stayed below loading the debris, Antonio and Miguel were above. A cave started to appear up to 3 meters in height, boarded up, completely sealed with stone slabs perfectly placed, covered with the remains of ash, smoked. I wanted to tell them right away, but I wanted to surprise them. Suddenly they shouted a goodbye, claiming they were going to get more men. Meantime I went to the camping site. And they did come back, with 4 peasants, that would make the work easier. Now they were down in the cave, certainly opening the inner cave. I went back in about 1 hour, and the 6 were covering the hole. A good part was already filled. They were just throwing the earth and stones down. In a few hours all was full, completely covered, just as it was at the beginning. I said nothing. I felt there was no use, and I remembered that at the entry to the cave there was a lot of debris, the remains of products, Japanese, Polish, British, from the USA, etc. The old locals said there were hundreds of ancient leather bags full of gold. Someone will get them eventually. To date, as far as I know, no one has gone back there. Don Bernardino. It is well known by historians and by many people, that in wide areas of the state of Michoacan there was the presence of French and Belgians that for many years tried to dominate our compatriots. That is the background anyway. The story starts like this. Daily from Carunguio on a dirt trail, Don Berna would travel to his Cambaro ranch on his sorrel horse. There were no roads, only dirt trails just for the traffic of horses, cattle and people. He planted corn, beans, fava, pumpkins and many other type of crops, but the main business was fattening and raising cattle, and usually he had pigs, chickens and dairy cows. He also had fruit trees, peaches, guavas, capulin, avocado, figs, bananas, grapefruit, etc., as well as mags, chayotes, and other plants. Those are the ones I remember. It was a large ranch, about 90 hectares. Many years went by working and enjoying the fruits of the soil. But one day Don Berner arrived home very excited. He said that in the south boundary of his ranch there were all kinds of machines building a road and that this would promote great progress for the whole area, and specially for his property. And daily Don Berner went to see the work the machines were doing. Although the road did not seem to lead to any logical destination, one of the machines was already working inside his own property, on a slope, and all the machines were getting near the same place. Don Berner searched for the person in charge, to talk to him. He was an engineer, so he told him they were within his property and said he was not going to allow them to keep on working. The man smiled and told him not to worry about what he considered damage to his property. He would be fully refunded, that he should take advantage of the situation and ask for a good price. Whatever he requested would be reimbursed. The enterprise belonged to a rich politician from Mexico City. Don Berner smiling happily thanked him and left. He went straight to the army depot. The general in charge was a good friend of his. And he told him what was happening and a little more. It turns out that around the year 1865 the Belgians were on their way to Morelia trying to remain unnoticed for obvious reasons. It was wartime. Cantumbaro seemed like a good place to spend the night. It is a place not visible to many eyes, it is somewhat hidden. On the slope of a hill they found a cave and decided to sleep there. It was a strategic place. Not wanting to carry the large amount of gold and weapons they had so they could arrive in Morelia sooner, they decided to leave all the heavy stuff there. Next day they covered the cave with stones and mud and covered the entry nailing sticks of the kind that would sprout and become bushes and trees and left and never returned. And now, on this day, there was all that machinery a few meters from that place excavating. Someone knows what is there. The general listened attentively and told him not to worry, he would help him. Next day 100 soldiers moved the machines all the way to the Mexico City road. The engineer and all the operators, as well as the machines, never returned. The landscape in Cantumbaro has probably changed very much, but I have not forgotten the place where that cave was located. Paco y Don Pedro. Don Pedro lived in the old center of the town, on a corner, across from the side of an evangelical church. Him and his wife had an old grocery store, but there was a lot of competition and they were considering closing it because they were not earning anything. They sold very little, and they were in their 70s and it was getting harder to wait on customers. So finally they closed it. They would live on their savings and with the help of their children. The house they lived in was one of the oldest in the area, built of adobe and quarry stone, with a brick floor and tile roof. The ceiling was of shingles and it was painted with white lime. Paco would go to the store regularly and chat with Don Pedro for hours about the history of old houses, the independence and the revolution. Now that the store was closed they did not see each other for some time. But luckily one day they ran into each other at the market. They were both shopping and Don Pedro joyfully invited Paco to visit. His door was always open to him. Paco began going often again. They talked about the same things, old houses, the independence, the revolution, and also about treasures. Paco always went to talk about the same things without ever getting bored, but one day Don Pedro stopped welcoming him. He just couldn't. He had a deep sadness. His wife was sick, actually extremely ill, frequently their children were there. They had already spent a great deal of money in the illness and time just went by. There was a chance for a cure, a treatment in Mexico City, but it was very expensive and they did not have enough money. Paco would visit briefly from time to time, and he decided to convince Don Pedro to allow him to try his treasure detecting equipment. Perhaps there was something in the house. Don Pedro accepted almost unwillingly. He looked almost like he was on drugs. He only asked him to do it at night, because during the day the place was full of people, his children, visitors, and so on. That very night Paco went to the house and got down to work. Immediately, with the help of Don Pedro, he started in the bedrooms, living, dining, kitchen, garden. But not in the ladies' bedroom. And there was only one other room full of junk that Don Pedro agreed to empty in a couple of days, and so they parted. Paco arrived again in about a week, but his friend was still very sad. His wife was sicker each day, but as a sort of distraction they went to the room in question. It was now completely empty. Don Pedro had cleaned it. So they began searching the floor. When there was only one wall left, the equipment beeped loudly all over that surface. Immediately Don Pedro got a pickaxe and Paco started to hit the wall. There was a rain of silver coins all over the place. Don Pedro began to cry and he fainted. In a few minutes he came back to himself and they continued the job. There were many coins. He gave Paco 1/3 of the total. They were both very happy and Paco went home with his load. It was a lot of money. He came back in a couple of weeks to visit Don Pedro. His wife opened the door. The lady was fully recovered. She hugged and kissed Paco. Don Pedro, very happy, just looked on. Don Domingo. It was a large family. They came from the state of Mexico, and arrived in the state of Michoacan, opening many stores, a gift shop, a hardware store, another that sold glass, 3 grocery stores, and they also bought a flour mill. But the one we are concerned with was a grocery store, the one owned by Don Domingo. It was the largest one, not only among the ones owned by his family, but in the whole town. It sold everything, even building materials. It sold more merchandise than an actual supermarket, so it always had a lot of people in it, customers, and many employees. Don Domingo was a very active man. From 6 o'clock in the morning he was delivering milk from his ranch, at 9 he was already in the store, and at night in the evening he would close up. And even on Sunday, after he went to Mass, he would attend a naturism course. And in his free time he would visit the sick. And so he spent his life for the last 40 years. Until he sold the store, he had all his responsibilities taken care of. He provided housing for all his employees and gave them a good severance fund. And now he dedicated himself to curing for free with herbs. He still was very active, and he had to vacate the store to hand it over clean and empty. One day he was alone in the empty store, just looking at the high electric bulbs, thinking how to go about removing the furnishings and the wooden planks from the last part, the cash registers area, the money collection zone, where he always had worked. This was there already when he opened the store. It was a square-shaped area of about 6 by 7 meters, surrounded by counters and a platform about 20 centimeters in height made with beams and wooden planks. Next day Don Domingo was walking with crutches. He hurt his foot in the store. A broken wooden plank had given way. Under the planks there was a chest full of gold coins. He went on with his usual life, taking care of the sick, healing people. His siblings decided to partition the building where the flour mill used to be. They were all getting on in years, and when their parents had bought the mill it was already an old building. So it was too expensive to remodel. They decided to partition it and to do whatever they wanted with their portion. Careful measures were taken of the whole property. Don Domingo was open to take whatever he was given, and his portion was the oldest part of the building, which had been used for offices. It was built of quarry stone, adobe, plank board floor, now painted red, a false cloth ceiling and a tile roof. Don Domingo built a separating wall on his portion, had a key made for the door, and so 5 months went by. Then he decided to use the place as a warehouse for feed for his cows. He had good lighting installed, had it painted, the restrooms were fixed, the whole place cleaned up, and presto, he had a large, nice warehouse. One night he was admiring and planning how to use his new warehouse. And then on the next day he was walking on crutches once more. He had hurt his foot. Under the flooring he had found gold coins. Again. But he behaved just the same, delivering milk, visiting the sick, healing people. Don Alfonso, Maria and her brother. He was 70, had 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl, and lived in San Javier. He was a real down-to-earth peasant. He left early, just like many other mornings, to go to the hills to bring wild yams. His 29-year-old son by then was probably already in Mexico City selling his clay handicrafts, pots, plates, jugs, pans and many other things. His 25-year-old daughter worked as a secretary for a prominent logger in Ocampo, Michoacan. She did have the opportunity to get an education. All 3 of them lead a normal life of work and progress. But on that day things changed. Maria returned as usual at 6 in the afternoon and there was no one home. That was not unusual, her dad probably would return later and her brother in 2 or 3 days. Meantime she prepared supper. Eggs and tomato sauce, refried beans, tortillas, cheese, lemonade, semitas, and blackberry atoll. When it got to be 9:30 at night and her dad was not home, she got worried since it was unusual for him to be out so late. Then she heard dogs barking, a sign that someone had arrived. And yes, it was Don Alfonso coming in, leaning on a heavy stick and limping. Maria ran to help him and together they came into the house. He went to clean himself up and then sat at the table. He was very hungry. His daughter's concern was to know what had happened to him and Don Alfonso told her. He had gone as usual to collect yams on the hills and he chose the hill located on the side of the archaeological ruins. It is the tallest hill in the region, very, very steep. He already had a good amount of yams and needed just a few more to finish. He left the sack on one side and took a few steps and suddenly he sank, he plunged into a hole. He had hurt himself, his leg ached, he lit a match to see where he was. It was a tunnel full of large pots lined up, on one side and on the other. The pots had items of all types, clay, stone, gold, other metals. But what he wanted was to get out. He had a difficult time but he finally succeeded. He was able to bring out a rustic but beautiful eagle made of gold inlaid with precious stones. He searched for a stick so could lean on it and go home. That was his brief story. Maria looked in the sack and there was the gold eagle, about 40 by 20 centimeters in size. Carefully she wrapped it in a red rag and put it away. Using some arnica ointment she massaged Don Alfonso's leg. He was feeling better already. 3 days went by and her brother Jose did not return, then 4, 5, 6 and 7. Maria was worried and requested permission at work to go Mexico City to search for her brother. Benito was just leaving for Michoacan when Maria arrived. He gave her the unpleasant news. Her brother was in jail. Maria was overwhelmed but Benito calmed her down. Already a lawyer for the artisans was taking care of his brother, defending him. They met with the lawyer and went to visit Jose. The situation was simple, they had selected him to accuse him of a crime he had not committed, something fairly frequent. And of course it was a matter of money, of paying up. Maria returned to San Javier and informed her father of the situation. He said very calmly, "We must sell the eagle." In the following days Maria contacted Paco and me and told us the story. The eagle had to be valued. find out how much it was worth and sell it. The decision was made. It was urgent. But if it was a prized we could be denounced. It could not be sold. It was forbidden. It could not be melted either, as it would lose its value. So we decided to take a photograph of the eagle, and Paco took it to show the lawyer, who showed a great deal of interest. He would consider himself paid and would negotiate to get Jose freed in just one day. And so it was. Paco delivered the eagle to the lawyer, and the same day Jose went free. Shortly after, Paco went into the tunnel on the hill and walked for tens of meters, always finding the same, the pots filled with a great treasure, but he did not take anything. I believe that to date it is still a felony. Don Miguel Hidalgo. In Michoacán, in the area of Tuxpan, Ciudad Hidalgo, Irimbo, Maravacio, and in Acambaro, Guanajuato, are the regions where it is believed that the cura Hidalgo had his haciendas and other properties. This was known in those days of the independence. Those sites were also useful to gather his armies, store money and food supplies, etc. It is interesting that based on this information, a large group of people, already in their declining years, affirmed, as always based on oral tradition, that the cura Hidalgo, in his innumerable journeys, stored 7 tons of coined gold someplace between Tuxpan and Ciudad Hidalgo. And that because of the movements of the War of Independence he was not able to recuperate the money, and it is still there. Time passed and many people looked and are still looking, in an infinity of locations without finding the gold, that large treasure. It has been searched for on riverbeds, in the ruins of some of the old haciendas, in caves and caverns, because it is believed that it is there, somewhere. Don Rafael took it very seriously to look for this treasure and searched for reliable information all over the region. It was helpful that he had relatives between Tuxpan and Ciudad Hidalgo, as well as in Tarandacuao, a few minutes from Maravacio, where he met some old ladies, relatives of the cura Hidalgo, who still kept some personal articles that belonged to him. Tarandacuao is in the state of Guanajuato. Also, his sainted mother, who was born around the year 1890, was very helpful to Don Rafael. She lived between Tuxpan and Ciudad Hidalgo, and his great-uncles passed on the information about Hidalgo's hidden gold. Don Rafael searched for many years the famous treasure. I did not believe any of this. But one day during the government of President Jose López Portillo, some army personnel arrived suddenly and together with Don Rafael went to the caverns near Ciudad Hidalgo, where they searched for the gold. There were hundreds of soldiers, trucks, dump trucks, helicopters, mining and heavy-duty equipment. They were there for 2 months working, searching. And as far as I know, they did not find anything. I suppose they knew something. They must have had information. More stories coming soon.